Today we're going to build this three-legged coffee table. For reals. Some of you might remember a little over a year ago, on Halloween, when I put out a video where I claimed I'd be building a three-legged coffee table. In short, it started like a real video, but quickly gave way to being a Halloween gag. You don't have to go watch it. Although, there was actually some pretty decent commentary on the virtues of a three-legged table versus one with four legs. Anyhow, lots of you commented that you'd like to see me build the table for real, and I kept saying that I would, so now, 14 months later, I'm making good on that promise. Alright, so that's the backstory. Now let's hop into the build. After I'd selected my wood and cut out roughly the amount I'd need to use, this is white oak by the way, I took it over the planer and milled it down to right around an inch thick. In total I'm going to need 3 legs, each of which is comprised of 2 pieces. We'll call them the upper leg and the lower leg. So with everything milled, I headed over to the table saw to prep all of my pieces for getting cut to shape, which will eventually happen using a tapering jig. I started by ripping them to width and then cutting a 15-degree miter on both ends. And now is probably a good time to mention that even though I only needed 3 legs in total, I actually made 4. This is a practice that I got in the habit of a while back. My thinking was, it really doesn't take much more time or money to produce 4 legs instead of 3, and that way if you mess something up, it just gives you a little bit more wiggle room. And actually, even if you don't mess anything up, it's always good to have a test piece that you can use to dial in various cuts or setups as you work on joinery. Basically, it's a nice little insurance policy and confidence booster, so why not? With the blanks ready to go, I started laying out my cut lines. I think my taper went from an inch at the bottom to about 2.5 inches at the top. Then I got out my tapering jig and had at it. In all of these shots, I've been working on the lower leg pieces. Once I finished them, I did the exact same thing to the leg uppers. The dimensions are different, but it's the exact same process to rip to width, mark out the tapers, cut tapers. So basically it just seemed a little bit redundant to show it. So I just focused on this piece instead. Normally when I build this table, I use half flaps to join the upper and the lower pieces. But here I decided to call an audible and go for miters instead. Here in the drawing you can see the difference. Basically the half flaps look different depending on what side you're viewing the piece from, whereas the miters will look the same on either side. Next I assembled the legs by gluing the miters. I'm going to reinforce these in a minute, but first I need the glue to dry up a bit. So while that's setting up, I'd like to take a second to thank my sponsor for this video, Storyblocks. If you're not familiar with Storyblocks, they're pretty much a one-stop shop for high-quality, royalty-free stock media. Members of the site can download anything from their library of over 400,000 images, vector files, icons, and so forth. And once they do, it's theirs to keep forever, no matter what. In addition to that, they also save 60% on marketplace content that they choose to buy. Now, you guys know that whenever possible, I like to work things into my project, and there's a ton of opportunities to do that, especially by combining their vector files with digital fabrication. But for this one, instead I gave myself a different sort of challenge. I basically gave myself a half hour to come up with a cool graphic using only assets that I found on Storyblocks. And I came up with 2. If you guys have ever seen season 1 of True Detective, they use this really cool double exposure sort of effect. I've always really liked it, so I wanted to play around with doing some sort of nature overlaid on man double exposure. I thought that they both came out pretty cool, but definitely liked the mountain man the best. So good news. If you want to play around too, to see what you can come up with, Storyblocks is giving away a week for free right now. Just click on the link in the description box below, and you can start a 7-day free trial today. So make something cool, and if you do, share it on Instagram and tag me. Alright, thanks Storyblocks. With my glue adequately set up, I started cutting in some negative space, or slots maybe, I don't know. Either way, some places where I could glue in splines. I don't really know that I got them perfectly centered, or actually I guess I do, because I know that I didn't. But I think I got them close enough to pass the eyeball test. Pretty much what I did was aim for as close as I could to the center on my first pass, then adjusted and fine-tuned on the second pass. Once I was happy with the location, I milled down a piece of scrap until it was tight, but not too tight to use for the splines. Then I roughed them out on the bandsaw and glued them in. The next morning, I removed the excess spline material, first by cutting off the bulk of it on the bandsaw, and then by fleshing up the remaining bit on the edge sander. So with that, the leg assemblies were finished and I could start working on the joinery for interlocking the three of them together. Let's cut away to a drawing for a second so I can explain this part a little bit better. So it's simultaneously really simple and kind of complex. Basically, you're going to cut a sort of angled half lap into each piece at 60 degrees, or 30, I guess, depending on how you think of it. Now, the tricky part has to do with the fact that the upper leg has a subtle taper. So at some point we're going to have to cut a flat spot into it so that there isn't a huge gap that shows up. I've done this various ways in the past, but here I tried a new technique and I think it worked out okay. More on that later though. Once all the joinery was cut, I test fit everything together, and I forgot to film this. But the important part was that I marked out where I'd need to cut out the flat spots to get everything to sit just right in the end. So in this shot, I'm just making sure that I have as much information as I can to not botch this when I go to make the next cuts. So like I said before, this is actually the first time that I've cut this joint this way. Normally what I do is I just leave a little flat spot when I initially cut the upper leg to shape. But I think doing it this way in theory should give a better fit. Who knows? But anyway, in these next shots, I'm just kind of figuring out things as I go. I started by tilting the table on my bandsaw to 30 degrees. Then I made an initial cut that marked both the back and the finished depth of my flat spot. Next, I set the table back to flat and set my fence, and then cut the bulk of the material that needed to be cleared out. I just went as deep as I could on the bandsaw, and then I cleared out the rest of the material with a hand saw. And then once you get all that removed, you can clean things up with a chisel if you need to. At this point, now I could finally glue the three leg assemblies together. This is always kind of tricky because you can't just work your way through doing a leg at a time. It'd be really easy to get the first two together that way, but you'd never get the third one in. So you have to sort of loosely get all three into position and then slowly inch them together until they're all in. Once I had everything glued together, I knew that I wasn't going to be needing that fourth test piece leg that I'd made, so I did what any red-blooded American would do and smashed it in the name of testing out joint strength. Want to see what happened? Go check it out on Instagram. There's a link in the description. And while you're busy thinking about clicking things, if you haven't already, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. Thanks. Three is a magical number. It's the number of dimensions we can perceive, the number of sides on a triangle, which is the most stable physical shape, and the number of men that it takes to raise a baby, assuming that one of them is Steve Gutenberg. And when you're designing a table and trying to decide on how many legs to use, or disciplining your kid and trying to figure out what to give them to the count of to, quote, get over here, sure, you could go with 4. But why would you, when there's 3? Special thanks to Asaf Cohen, Chris German, Andreas Christensen, Evan Shannon, Chad Zerf, Kyle Gokin, and the rest of my Patreon supporters for making these videos possible. You are my largest and most reliable source of funding. And put simply, I couldn't do what I'm doing without you. So, thank you. If you want to find out more about how you can support the show too, Click on the Patreon button here or in the link below to check it out. And as always, no pressure. See you next time.